The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon in 1944, turning the red Georgia clay into a slick, unforgiving mud that clung to boots and truck tires alike. Camp Allenwood sat 15 miles outside of Macon, a sprawling prisoner-of-war facility that had sprung up almost overnight when the War Department decided the rural South was perfect for housing captured enemy soldiers. The barracks were simple wooden structures painted a dull olive green, arranged in neat rows behind double fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter at regular intervals, manned by soldiers too old or too young for the European theater, or those who'd already seen enough of it. In the camp kitchen, a converted warehouse with industrial stoves and long metal prep tables, Margaret Holloway stood with her hands on her hips, surveying the ingredients she'd been allocated for the evening meal. She was 53 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen two wars now, this one and the Great War that had taken her brother. She'd been cooking for large groups since she was 17, first at her family's boarding house in Savannah, then at the church socials, and now here, feeding 200 German prisoners 3 meals a day. "They're not gonna like it," said Private Tommy Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who'd been assigned to kitchen duty after a training accident left him with a permanent limp. He was 20 years old, rail-thin, with quick hands and an even quicker smile. He stood at the table, measuring out cornmeal from a 50-pound sack. "Don't care much what they like," Margaret replied, though her tone wasn't harsh. "We got cornmeal, we got buttermilk that's about to turn, we got lard and salt. We're making cornbread, and they'll eat it or go hungry." The third member of their kitchen crew, Corporal James Washington, laughed from where he was stoking the fire in the massive oven. James was a 35-year-old black man from Alabama, built like a boxer, with hands scarred from years of farm work before the Army. He'd seen action in North Africa before a shrapnel wound to his shoulder brought him stateside. "You know they're going to complain. Those boys expect schnitzel and spatzel. They think American food is beneath them." "Let 'em complain," Margaret said, reaching for a mixing bowl so large it took both arms to lift. "My grandmother made cornbread through Sherman's march. My mother made it through the Depression, and I'll make it through this war. It's honest food, and it's kept Southern folk alive for generations." The recipe she used wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in her fingers, in the way she could judge the right amount of cornmeal by weight alone, in how she knew when the buttermilk had been added in just the right proportion. 2 eggs per pan, no more. A palmful of sugar to cut the bitterness, but not so much it became cake. Salt to taste. Lard melted in the pans until it sizzled and smoked, then the batter poured in to create that perfect golden crust. Outside, through the kitchen's high windows, she could see the prisoners being marched back from their work detail. They'd been out repairing roads, filling potholes, clearing drainage ditches, work that freed up American men for combat duty. They walked in formation, their gray uniforms darkened by rain, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and something else. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. These were Afrika Korps veterans mostly, captured in Tunisia after Rommel's defeat. Men who still believed Germany would somehow win this war. The mess hall was attached to the kitchen by a pair of swinging doors. It was a cavernous space with long tables and benches capable of seating 300 if needed. At precisely 1700 hours, the doors would open and the prisoners would file in, take their trays, receive their portions, and eat in relative silence under the watchful eyes of armed guards stationed at each corner. Tommy Chen was cutting the cornbread into squares, the steam rising from each piece as the knife passed through. "You know what Sergeant Brandt said last week when we served that bean soup? He said, 'Is this what you feed your dogs in America?'" "Sergeant Brandt can kiss my apron," Margaret said flatly, which made both men laugh. "That soup had ham hock, navy beans, and fresh carrots. It was better than what half of Georgia's eating right now with rationing." James carefully transferred the cornbread squares onto serving trays. "The funny thing is," he said, "most of these boys are farm kids, farmers from Bavaria and Prussia. They know hard times, they know making do, but they got their pride wrapped up in this idea that Germany's superior, that everything German is better." "Pride goes before a fall," Margaret quoted, wiping her hands on her apron. "The Bible says that, and I've seen it proven true more times than I can count." The whistle blew outside, a sharp, piercing sound that signaled the end of the workday. Within minutes, the prisoners would be lined up outside the mess hall, waiting for the doors to open. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded to Tommy and James. "All right, boys, let's feed the masses." When the doors opened, the prisoners filed in with military precision. They were young, most of them, though some bore the weathered faces of career soldiers. Their uniforms were marked with PW in large white letters on the back. They'd been issued sturdy work boots by the U.S. Army, and most of them were healthier now than when they'd arrived. Regular meals and no combat will do that to a man. Sergeant Klaus Brandt was near the front of the line. He was 28, tall and broad-shouldered, with pale blonde hair cut military short and ice-blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with cold calculation. He'd been an officer in the Afrika Korps, a decorated veteran who'd fought from Tobruk to Kasserine Pass. Even in captivity, the other prisoners deferred to him. He reached the serving station where Tommy stood with a large serving spoon. Tommy placed 2 squares of cornbread on Brandt's tray alongside the evening's main course, a stew of beef, potatoes, and carrots that had been simmering for hours. Brandt looked down at the cornbread, then back up at Tommy. "Was ist das?" he asked, though his English was excellent. He knew what it was. He was making a point. "Cornbread, Sergeant Brandt," he replied evenly. "Southern style, fresh from the oven." Brandt picked up one of the squares, turning it over in his fingers. Several prisoners behind him craned their necks to see. "It looks like Viehfutter, animal feed." He spoke loudly enough that those around him could hear. A few laughed. "It's bread, Sergeant Brandt," Tommy said, his jaw tightening slightly. "Made from corn. Been feeding Americans for centuries." "In Germany," Brandt said, setting the cornbread back down on his tray with exaggerated distaste, "we would not serve this to prisoners, even in wartime. It is beneath human dignity." From the kitchen doorway, Margaret watched this exchange. She'd seen men like Brandt before. Men who needed to maintain their sense of superiority, even in defeat, even behind barbed wire. She understood it in a way. Pride was sometimes all a captured soldier had left. But she also understood something else. Cornbread was more than food. It was history, resilience, survival. It was Native Americans teaching colonists how to cultivate and grind corn. It was enslaved people creating nourishment from limited ingredients. It was frontier families making meals from what they could grow. It was the South feeding itself through occupation, through poverty, through every hardship that came its way. That golden square of cornbread sitting on Brandt's tray contained generations of American struggle and adaptation, and he'd just called it animal feed. James Washington stepped up beside Margaret, his voice low. "You want me to say something?" She shook her head. "No need. Truth always reveals itself. Just takes time." As the prisoners settled at their tables, eating their stew and mostly avoiding the cornbread, Margaret noticed one young prisoner, couldn't have been more than 19, tentatively break off a corner of his portion and taste it. His eyes widened slightly. He glanced around to see if anyone was watching, then ate the rest of his piece, quickly, hungrily. He didn't reach for the second square, though. Not with Sergeant Brandt sitting 3 tables away, holding court with his fellow NCOs, entertaining them with derisive comments about American cuisine. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming on the metal roof of the mess hall, creating a constant background rhythm to the sound of forks on metal trays and the low murmur of German conversation. Margaret turned back to the kitchen, where tomorrow's breakfast already needed planning, where the never-ending cycle of feeding this camp would continue, whether the prisoners appreciated it or not. But as she began cleaning the mixing bowls, she couldn't shake the image of that young prisoner's face, the surprise, the hunger, the furtive pleasure of discovering that this animal feed actually tasted of something real, something honest, something good. Margaret Holloway's days began at 04:30 hours, long before the sun rose over the pine forests of Georgia. She lived in a small cottage on the camp grounds, one of 4 structures designated for civilian staff who worked full-time at Camp Allenwood. The cottage had belonged to a sharecropper family before the government purchased the land, and it still had that lived-in quality. Worn floorboards that creaked in specific places, a kitchen window that stuck halfway up, a front porch with a slight tilt to the left. She would wake to darkness, light her kerosene lamp, and dress in the same practical clothes she wore every day: sturdy brown trousers, a cotton work shirt, thick socks, and boots that had been resoled 2 times. Then she'd walk the quarter-mile to the kitchen, her breath visible in the cold morning air, carrying her lunch pail in one hand and her grandmother's recipe notebook in the other. That notebook was her most precious possession. Bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and stained with decades of use, it contained recipes written in 3 generations of handwriting. Her grandmother's elegant script from the 1870s, her mother's practical notations from the turn of the century, and her own additions started when she was just a girl, learning to cook at her mother's side. The cornbread recipe wasn't written in the book. It didn't need to be. But there were others: sweet potato pie, collard greens with ham hock, buttermilk biscuits, chicken and dumplings, peach cobbler, red-eye gravy. Recipes that told the story of the South through food, through the ingenuity of making something delicious from whatever was available. Tommy Chen was always the second to arrive, usually around 0500 hours. He'd ride his bicycle from the barracks where the enlisted men slept, his breath huffing out in clouds. Margaret would have coffee ready, real coffee, not the chicory blend civilians were stuck with, thanks to the camp's military supply, and they'd share it in companionable silence while planning the day's meals. "My grandmother cooked too," Tommy told her one morning, about a week after the cornbread incident. "In San Francisco. She had a restaurant in Chinatown. Small place, maybe 10 tables, but the food!" He made a gesture with his hands, as if releasing something beautiful into the air. She could make magic with rice, vegetables, a little pork. People would line up.
"What happened to it?" Margaret asked, measuring out flour for biscuits. She had to close when they started talking about interning Japanese families. We're Chinese, but some people couldn't tell the difference, didn't want to. She was 70 years old, and she had to board up her restaurant, the place she'd built over 30 years. His voice carried an edge of old anger. "She died 6 months later. Broken heart," my mother said. Margaret stopped her measuring and looked at him directly. "I'm sorry, Tommy. That's a hard thing, losing your life's work for no good reason." "Yeah." He picked up a mixing bowl and started on the biscuit dough. "That's why I don't have much patience for Sergeant Brandt and his superiority act, like being German makes him better than American food, better than us. My grandmother's restaurant was as good as anything in Germany, better, probably. But it didn't matter. She wasn't white, so she wasn't worth protecting." James Washington arrived at 0530 hours, as he did every morning, bringing with him the camp's daily provisions requisition form. He'd stop at the supply depot first, checking what had arrived overnight, what was running low, what substitutions would need to be made. He was meticulous about it, keeping detailed logs that impressed even the camp's quartermaster. "Morning, Margaret. Morning, Tommy." He hung his coat on the hook by the door and rolled up his sleeves. "We got a problem. Sugar shipment's delayed. Won't be here until Friday at the earliest." "How much we got left?" Margaret asked. "Maybe 20 pounds. Enough for coffee and essential baking, but not much else." She nodded, already adjusting her mental meal plans. "All right, we'll do savory dishes. More stews, more vegetables. That cornmeal we got, we can make Johnny cakes for breakfast instead of pancakes. Don't need sugar for those." The three of them worked in practiced rhythm, their movements coordinated through months of collaboration. James would prep the main ingredients, butchering meat, peeling potatoes, washing greens. Tommy handled the baking and the delicate work, measuring, mixing, monitoring oven temperatures. Margaret orchestrated everything, moving between stations, tasting, adjusting, making dozens of small decisions that collectively determined whether 200 men would eat well or merely eat adequately. She took pride in the work, though it wasn't the kind of pride that needed recognition. It was the quiet satisfaction of doing something difficult and doing it well, of maintaining standards even when no one would blame her for cutting corners, of treating even enemy prisoners as human beings who deserved proper nourishment. Her husband, Robert, had felt the same way about his work. He'd been a civil engineer, designing bridges and water systems, and he'd approach each project with the same meticulous care, whether it was for a wealthy client or a poor rural county. He died in 1940, 4 years now, when a construction accident caused a half-built bridge to collapse. Margaret had been cooking for church functions when she got the news. She'd finished the meal service first. What else could she do with 300 people expecting dinner? And then she'd gone home and sat in the dark for 3 days. The Army recruiter had come to town 6 months later, looking for civilian contractors to work at the new POW camp. Margaret had volunteered immediately, not out of patriotism, though she loved her country, not for the money, though it was better than what most women could earn. She had volunteered because she needed to be useful, needed to work, needed to transform her grief into something productive. Around 7:30 hours, the prisoners would begin arriving at work details throughout the camp. Margaret could see them through the kitchen windows, young men in gray uniforms, marching in formation, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. Some would be assigned to the motor pool, some to maintenance, some to the farm detail that supplied the camp with fresh vegetables. Sergeant Brandt usually led the road repair crew. Margaret would watch him sometimes, standing tall and straight, barking orders in German, maintaining discipline even though he was a prisoner himself. He reminded her of her brother, Thomas, who'd been a sergeant in the First World War. Thomas had died at Belleau Wood, and the Army sent back his personal effects in a small wooden box, his Bible, his letters, his wedding ring, though he'd never married. The ring had belonged to their father. She understood that soldiers needed structure, needed purpose, needed to believe in something larger than themselves. Even enemy soldiers, even men like Brandt, who seemed to look down on everything American. They were still human beings, far from home, held captive in a strange land, eating strange food, wondering if they'd ever see their families again. The cornbread incident had been bothering her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just that Brandt had insulted her cooking. She'd dealt with plenty of criticism over the years, and she had thick skin. It was the dismissiveness of it, the casual cruelty, the way he'd held up that piece of cornbread like it was evidence of American inferiority. The way the other prisoners had laughed, though I'd noticed some of them looking uncomfortable. "You're thinking about the cornbread again," James said, reading her expression as he often could. They developed a shorthand over the months working together, a way of communicating that went beyond words. "I may be," she admitted, stirring a large pot of oatmeal for breakfast. "Can't help feeling like it's bigger than just bread." "It is bigger," Tommy said, sliding trays of biscuits into the oven. "It's about respect, about recognizing that different doesn't mean inferior. Germans think they're superior. That's the whole problem with this war. They think being German, being white in a specific way, makes them better than everyone else. Jews, Poles, Russians, Americans were all beneath them." Margaret added a pinch of salt to the oatmeal, tasted it, added another pinch. "My mother used to say that people who need to put others down are usually trying to convince themselves they matter. They're scared that if they admit someone else has value, it somehow takes away from their own." "Your mother sounds like she was wise," Tommy said. "She was. She lived through things that would have broken most people, but she never became bitter. She just kept cooking, kept feeding people, kept believing that sharing a meal was sacred work." She smiled at the memory. "She used to say that you couldn't hate someone while breaking bread with them. Not really. That eating together was the first step towards understanding." The breakfast service went smoothly. The prisoners filed through, received their oatmeal, their biscuits, their coffee, and their small portions of scrambled eggs made from powdered eggs that never quite tasted right, but provided essential protein. They ate quietly, efficiently, like men accustomed to military routine.
Brandt was there, of course, tall and commanding even in the breakfast line. He accepted his tray without comment this time, though Margaret noticed him examining the biscuits with the same critical eye he'd given the cornbread. He ate them, though. He ate everything on his tray, just as all the prisoners did. Whatever else they thought about American food, they were hungry men doing physical labor, and they needed the calories. After breakfast service ended and the prisoners had marched off to their work details, Margaret, Tommy, and James began preparing lunch. Vegetable soup today, using the last of the fresh carrots and celery before they turned. Sandwiches made from yesterday's bread and potted meat. Apples from the camp orchard, small and slightly bruised but sweet. And cornbread. Always cornbread, because they had cornmeal in abundance and buttermilk, and it was economical and filling and nutritious. Because it was part of who she was and where she came from. Because she wasn't going to let Sergeant Klaus Brandt's disdain change what she knew to be true about honest, good food. Tommy watched her mixing the batter with perhaps more vigor than strictly necessary. "You know," he said carefully, "you could just stop making cornbread for a while. Make regular bread instead. It might cause less friction." Margaret paused, her hands deep in the mixing bowl. "No," she said finally, "no, I don't think I will, because that would be letting him win. And I didn't live through the Depression and lose my husband and volunteer to cook for prisoners just to let some German sergeant tell me my grandmother's recipes aren't good enough." James laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "There's the Margaret I know. I was worried you might actually be considering backing down." "Never," she said, and meant it. The pattern continued for 2 more weeks. Margaret would prepare cornbread as part of the evening meal, the prisoners would accept it with varying degrees of reluctance, and Sergeant Brandt would make his subtle displays of contempt. He never said anything directly to Margaret, that would have been beneath his dignity, but he made sure his opinions were known. "He are trying to humiliate us," he told his fellow prisoners one evening, speaking German but loud enough that the guards could hear the tone, if not the words. "They feed us peasant food, yellow grain meant for chickens, and expect us to be grateful. This is psychological warfare, yeah? They want to break our spirits by treating us as less than human." Some of the younger prisoners nodded along, taking their cues from Brandt. Others remained silent, uncertain, and a few, like Private Ernst Weber, the 19-year-old who'd secretly enjoyed that first piece of cornbread, would slip the bread into their pockets when Brandt wasn't watching, saving it for later when they could eat without judgment. The tension in the camp was subtle but growing. Captain Howard Mills, the camp commander, noticed it during his weekly inspection rounds. Mills was a career officer in his mid-40s. Balding and stocky,
with the methodical nature of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in the military bureaucracy. He took his responsibilities seriously, adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention's requirements for prisoner treatment while maintaining security and discipline. "Mrs. Holloway," he said one morning, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his clipboard and his perpetually concerned expression, "I need to speak with you about the prisoners' meals." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and gave him her full attention. "Something wrong with the food, Captain?" "Not wrong exactly, but I've been receiving, let's call them informal complaints, through intermediaries. The German NCOs have been expressing dissatisfaction with certain items on the menu." "The cornbread," Margaret said flatly. "It wasn't a question. Among other things, they claim it's not suitable for human consumption, that it's coarse, tasteless, and," he consulted his clipboard, "an insult to civilized standards." Tommy Chen, who was rolling out pie dough at the counter, made a sound halfway between a laugh and a snort. "Civilized standards? That's rich coming from Nazis." "Private Chen," Mills said with a warning tone, though his heart didn't seem to be in it. "The prisoners are protected under international law, regardless of their political affiliations or the crimes of their government. We have an obligation to treat them humanely." "And we do," Margaret said firmly. "Captain Mills, those men are eating better here than most civilians in Georgia. They're getting 3 hot meals a day, adequate portions, variety in their diet. The cornbread is made from quality ingredients. It's nutritious, it's filling, and it's part of regional cuisine that sustained millions of Americans for generations." "I'm not questioning the quality of your cooking," Mills said, and he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with this entire conversation. "Your service here has been exemplary, but I need to maintain order in this camp. If the prisoners feel they're being mistreated, even if that feeling is completely unjustified, it creates problems, morale issues, potential unrest." "So what are you asking me to do?" Margaret crossed her arms. "Stop making cornbread? Start making schnitzel and sauerkraut? Pretend we're running a hotel instead of a POW camp?"
"I'm asking you to consider whether this particular battle is worth fighting," Mills said carefully. "We have limited resources. If we can reduce friction by making small adjustments to the menu, perhaps that's the prudent course." James Washington had been listening quietly while scrubbing a large stock pot, but now he spoke up. "Captain, with respect, this isn't about cornbread. It's about these prisoners thinking they're superior to us, to Americans, and especially to some of us more than others." He didn't elaborate, but his meaning was clear. Mills sighed heavily, suddenly looking much older than his 40-some years. "I know, Corporal. Believe me, I know. We've had incidents, comments, attitudes. The German prisoners are generally well-behaved, but there's an underlying current of superiority complex, I suppose you'd call it. The Nazi ideology runs deep." "Then maybe they need to learn that they lost," Tommy said quietly, "that their superiority is imaginary, that American food, American people, American values, they're just as good as German ones, better even, because we don't build our identity on thinking everyone else is inferior." Margaret felt a surge of affection for both of these young men who'd become far more than just her kitchen staff. They'd become friends, allies, and in some ways, the family she'd lost. "Captain Mills," she said, keeping her voice level and professional, "I respect your position, but I'm not going to stop making cornbread. If Sergeant Brandt and his followers have a problem with Southern cooking, they're welcome to skip that portion of their meal. No one's forcing them to eat it." Mills looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Holloway, I won't press the issue, but I want you to be careful. These are proud men who've been defeated and imprisoned. Pride can make people do foolish things." After he left, The kitchen fell silent except for the bubbling of pots on the stove and the crackle of the fire in the oven. Finally, Tommy spoke. "Do you think he's right about pride making people foolish?" "Oh, I know he's right," Margaret said, returning to her work with renewed determination. "I've seen it my whole life. But there's pride and then there's dignity. Pride is thinking you're better than everyone else. Dignity is knowing your own worth without needing to diminish others. And I'll be damned if I let someone take away my dignity just because he's got too much pride." That evening's meal service was tense in a way it hadn't been before. Word had somehow spread among the prisoners that there had been complaints about the food, that the German leadership was making a stand about the cornbread. When the men filed through the serving line, many of them made a show of refusing the cornbread, passing their trays along without taking any, while glancing toward the tables where Brandt and the other NCOs sat. But not all of them. Private Weber took his portion, as did several others. An older prisoner named Heinrich, a former farmer from Bavaria, actually smiled at Margaret and said in broken English, "Danke, good bread." A few younger prisoners looked torn, clearly wanting the food but afraid of social consequences. Margaret served each man without comment, her expression neutral, professional. But inside, something was hardening. She'd spent her life feeding people, family, friends, church communities, and now prisoners. It was the work she'd been called to do, work that connected her to her mother and grandmother and all the women who'd come before, women who'd used their skills to nurture and sustain life even in the hardest circumstances. And she wasn't going to apologize for it, not to Sergeant Brandt, not to anyone. After the dinner service, as they were cleaning up, the young guard named Private Danny Morrison came into the kitchen. He was barely 18, a local boy from Macon, and he often lingered around the kitchen hoping for leftover pie or biscuits. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his round face troubled, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Sergeant Brandt's been talking to the other prisoners. He's saying that the cornbread is a deliberate insult, that you're trying to humiliate them by serving slave food." "Slave food," Margaret repeated, her voice very quiet. "Yes, ma'am. He said that cornbread was what slaves ate, and by giving it to German soldiers, you're implying they're no better than slaves. Some of the prisoners are getting really angry about it." James Washington set down the pot he'd been drying with enough force that it rang like a gong. "That racist son of a—" He caught himself, took a deep breath. That man doesn't know the first thing about history, doesn't know that cornbread kept poor white farmers alive too, kept everybody alive when there wasn't anything else. And even if slaves did eat it, so what? Were they not human? Did their food not matter? Tommy's face had gone pale. "This is getting dangerous," he said. "If Brandt's convincing the prisoners that Mrs. Holloway is deliberately insulting them, deliberately comparing them to slaves, it could escalate. They might do something." "Like what?" Margaret asked, though her stomach had gone cold.
I don't know. Refuse to work? Start a protest? Or worse?" He didn't finish the sentence. Private Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I just thought you should know, ma'am. Captain Mills probably ought to know too, but I wanted to tell you first." "Thank you, Danny," Margaret said. "You did the right thing." After the young guard left, the three of them stood in the kitchen, surrounded by clean pots and swept floors and the lingering smell of that evening's beef stew. The quiet should have been peaceful, but instead it felt ominous, like the stillness before a storm. "Maybe," Tommy said hesitantly, "maybe we should actually stop making the cornbread, just until things calm down. It's not worth someone getting hurt." Margaret thought about her grandmother, who'd cooked through Sherman's burning of Georgia, about her mother, who'd fed her family through the Depression when they sometimes didn't know where the next meal would come from, about all the women who'd taken simple ingredients and transformed them into nourishment, into love, into survival itself. "No," she said, "we keep making cornbread. Because if we stop, we're admitting that Brandt's right, that our food, our culture, our history, it's somehow shameful. And I won't do that. I won't let some Nazi sergeant rewrite what cornbread means." James looked at her with something like awe. "You're one stubborn woman, Margaret Holloway." "I prefer to think of it as persistent," she said, managing a small smile. "Now, we've got breakfast prep to think about. Life doesn't stop just because some people can't appreciate good cooking." But that night, lying in her bed in the small cottage, listening to the wind rattle the windows, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Brandt's words: slave food, deliberate insult, humiliation. She thought about the complex, painful history woven into every bite of cornbread, the Native American origins, the African American innovations, the white Southern poverty, all of it tangled together in ways that couldn't be separated. And she thought about dignity, about how the most dangerous thing you could do to people was try to take away their dignity, but how dignity couldn't be given or taken, only claimed or surrendered. She'd claimed hers long ago, and she wasn't surrendering it now. Outside her window, the guard towers were lit up against the darkness, their spotlights sweeping across the compound in regular patterns. 200 German prisoners slept in those barracks, 200 men far from home, caught in a war they couldn't escape. Some of them, maybe most of them, were just like young Ernst Weber, farm boys and factory workers who'd been conscripted, who fought because they'd been ordered to, who probably just wanted to survive and go home. But some of them were true believers, men like Brandt, who'd bought into the ideology completely, who genuinely believed in German superiority, in racial hierarchies, and the right of the strong to dominate the weak. And somehow, a simple square of cornbread had become the battleground where these worldviews would collide. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon when the winter sun hung low and pale in the Georgia sky. The prisoners had finished their lunch, vegetable soup and bread, no cornbread today because Margaret had made yeast rolls instead, a small tactical retreat that had cost her sleep to decide upon, and were being marched back to their work details when Sergeant Brandt stopped at the kitchen door. He stood there for a moment, tall and rigid in his gray uniform, his pale blue eyes surveying the kitchen interior like a general assessing enemy territory. Margaret was at the sink, washing lunch dishes. Tommy was inventorying supplies in the storage room. James was outside, bringing in firewood for the oven. "Mrs. Holloway," Brandt said, in his precise, accented English, "I wish to speak with you." She dried her hands slowly, deliberately, then turned to face him. Through the doorway, she could see the guard assigned to the work detail, young Morrison again, looking uncertain about whether he should intervene. She gave him a small shake of her head. She could handle this. "Sergeant Brandt," she said evenly, "what can I do for you?" He stepped just inside the doorway, careful not to cross the threshold fully. That would be against camp regulations, and he was always very correct about regulations. "I wish to understand," he said, "why you insist on serving this cornbread. We have made clear that it is not acceptable food, yet you continue." "It's perfectly acceptable food. It's nutritious, it's filling, and it's part of American culinary tradition. Just because it's not what you're used to doesn't make it unacceptable. It is coarse. It is common. It is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "It is food for peasants and slaves. In Germany, we would not serve such things." "Well," Margaret said, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel entering it, "you're not in Germany. You're in Georgia. And in Georgia, we eat cornbread.
Rich and poor, black and white, we all eat cornbread. It doesn't make us less than you. It makes us American." Brandt's jaw tightened. "You do not understand. I have tried to be respectful, to follow the proper channels, but my men are suffering. They feel humiliated. They feel that you are deliberately trying to degrade them by serving food that is beneath human dignity." "Food can't be beneath human dignity," Margaret said, and now she stepped toward him, closing the distance between them. She was a small woman, barely 5'3", but she drew herself up to her full height and met his eyes without flinching. "Food is what keeps us alive. It's what connects us to our history, our families, our land. My grandmother made this cornbread. My mother made this cornbread. I make this cornbread. And there is nothing shameful about it." "Your grandmother was perhaps a slave?" Brandt asked. And there was something calculated in the question, something designed to wound. The kitchen went very still. Tommy had emerged from the storage room and stood frozen in the doorway. Outside, Private Morrison had taken a step closer, his hand moving unconsciously toward his rifle. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back, hot and fierce. "My grandmother," she said, each word deliberate and clear, was a free woman who lived through a war that burned her state to the ground. She cooked for Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers both, because hungry men are just hungry men, and she believed feeding people was holy work. She taught my mother, who taught me, that the measure of a person isn't what they eat, but how they treat others. And right now, Sergeant Brandt, you're measuring pretty poorly." Something flickered in Brandt's eyes, surprise perhaps, or anger, or something else she couldn't quite read. "I meant no disrespect to your grandmother," he said stiffly. "I merely sought to understand why you persist in serving food that has such unfortunate associations." "The only unfortunate association," she said, "is the one you're creating. Cornbread doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not about slavery or poverty or being lesser. It's about survival. It's about taking what you have and making something good from it. It's about not giving up, even when times are hard." "We are prisoners," Brandt said. And for the first time, his voice carried a hint of something vulnerable beneath the rigid pride. "We have lost our country. This much is becoming clear, though we do not speak of it. We have lost our homes, our futures. We have nothing left but our dignity. And when you serve us this cornbread, it feels like you are taking even that." The honesty of it caught Margaret off guard. She saw him suddenly not as the arrogant enemy soldier, but as what he actually was, a man far from home, facing the collapse of everything he'd believed in, clinging desperately to the only thing he had left, his sense of superiority. "Your dignity isn't in what you eat," she said, her voice gentler now. "It's in how you conduct yourself, how you treat others, whether you can admit when you're wrong." "I am not wrong about the cornbread," he said, but there was less certainty in his tone now. "Then prove it," Margaret said suddenly, the idea forming as she spoke. "Eat it. Really eat it. Not just push it around your plate or feed it to the younger prisoners when you think no one's watching. Actually taste it. The way you would taste food in Germany, with attention, with respect for the hands that made it." "You are challenging me?" Brandt said. "I'm offering you a chance," Margaret said, "to understand something about America, about us, about why we're not what you think we are." For a long moment, Brandt said nothing. Then he nodded, a single sharp movement. "Very well. Tomorrow, at evening meal, I will eat your cornbread, and then we will see." He turned and walked away, his boots loud on the wooden floor, leaving Margaret standing in the kitchen doorway with her heart pounding and her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Tommy was beside her instantly. "Margaret, what did you just do?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but it felt right." James had come back with the firewood and caught the end of the exchange. "That man's not going to suddenly change his mind because he eats cornbread, Margaret. People like him don't work that way." "Maybe not, but I had to try.
Because what's the alternative? We just accept that he thinks we're inferior? That our food, our culture, everything we are is beneath him? I can't do that. I won't. That evening, Margaret made cornbread with more care than she'd ever taken before. She used her finest cornmeal, ground from corn she'd selected herself from the camp farm. She added an extra egg to make it richer. She melted the lard until it was exactly the right temperature, hot enough to create that perfect crust, but not so hot it would burn. She poured the batter into the pans with steady hands and slid them into the oven, watching through the glass door as they rose and turned golden. When she pulled them out, the cornbread was perfect, golden brown on top with crispy edges and a tender, moist interior. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and welcoming, carrying with it the scent of home, of comfort, of everything good she'd ever known about cooking. Tommy and James stood on either side of her, looking at the pans of cornbread like they were something precious.
"It's beautiful," Tommy said quietly. "It's just cornbread," Margaret replied, but she knew what he meant. It was more than cornbread. It was a statement, a challenge, a hope. It was everything she'd been trying to say about dignity and worth and the value of honest things. The evening meal service had a different quality to it that night. Word had spread among the prisoners that Sergeant Brandt had accepted a challenge regarding the cornbread, though the details were unclear. Some thought it was a contest. Others thought it was some kind of test. All of them sensed that something important was happening, though they couldn't quite articulate what. When Brandt came through the serving line, Margaret placed 2 squares of cornbread on his tray herself, meeting his eyes as she did so. He nodded, took his tray, and walked to his usual table. The mess hall fell silent. 200 prisoners stopped eating, stopped talking, and watched as Sergeant Klaus Brandt picked up a square of cornbread, broke it in half, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Margaret found herself holding her breath. He swallowed, took another bite, and then another. And then, in the silence of that vast hall, with every eye upon him, he reached for the second square. Private Ernst Weber, sitting 3 tables away, began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster. Another prisoner joined him, then another. Within moments, half the mess hall was applauding, though many looked confused about what exactly they were celebrating. Brandt finished the second square of cornbread, set down his tray, and stood. He walked to the kitchen door where Margaret stood watching. Private Morrison moved to intercept him, but Margaret waved him back. "Mrs. Holloway," Brandt said, his voice carrying across the now silent hall, "I must tell you something. The cornbread, it is good. It is very good, and I have been—" He paused, the admission clearly costing him. "I have been foolish and wrong." The mess hall erupted. Some prisoners cheered, others argued in rapid German. Some sat in stunned silence. The guards moved in closer, uncertain whether this was the beginning of order or chaos. But Margaret just smiled. "Thank you, Sergeant Brandt. Would you like the recipe? You could make it for your family when you get home." He blinked, clearly not having expected that response. Yes, I would like that, very much." "Then come by the kitchen tomorrow morning, and I'll write it out for you, in English and German both." The change in Camp Allenwood wasn't immediate, and it wasn't universal, but it was real. Sergeant Brandt's public acceptance of the cornbread created space for other prisoners to admit they'd been enjoying it all along, or to try it for the first time without fear of judgment. Private Ernst Weber started coming to the kitchen window during breaks, asking Margaret questions about American food, about cooking techniques, about her recipes. He told her about his mother's kitchen in a small village outside Munich, about the bread she baked every morning, about how he missed the smell of it more than almost anything else about home. Heinrich, the older farmer from Bavaria, began helping in the camp garden, working alongside Margaret to plan what they'd plant come spring. He taught her about German vegetable varieties, and she taught him about southern growing techniques adapted to the red Georgia clay.
They communicated in a mixture of broken English, hand gestures, and the universal language of people who understood the land. Brandt kept his word about the recipe. He came to the kitchen the next morning, and Margaret wrote it out carefully, translating measurements into metric as best she could. He stood at the counter, studying it like it was a military document requiring analysis. "This is your grandmother's recipe?" he asked. "It is. She made it through the hardest times imaginable. It sustained her family, kept them alive, gave them strength to keep going when everything else had been taken from them." He folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. "I will make this when I return to Germany, if I return to Germany." The last part was said quietly, almost to himself. "You will," Margaret said, with certainty she didn't entirely feel. "This war will end. You'll go home, and when you do, you'll make this cornbread, and you'll remember this camp, and maybe you'll remember that Americans weren't what you thought they were." "We were taught," Brandt said slowly, "that Americans were soft, weak, that your country was too divided, too mixed with inferior races to be strong, that you could never defeat Germany because you had no unity, no discipline, no true strength." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now, I think perhaps we were taught lies, or at least not the full truth. Your cornbread, it is simple food, yes, but it required skill to make. It required knowledge passed down through generations. It required discipline and care. These are not the qualities of weak people." "No, they're not," Margaret agreed.
The weeks that followed brought spring to Georgia. The camp's garden began to flourish under Heinrich's expert care and Margaret's practical management. The prisoners' work details expanded to include more agricultural projects, and the men seemed to take to the work with genuine enthusiasm. Physical labor, fresh air, and the simple satisfaction of watching things grow, these were universal comforts that transcended nationality. Captain Mills called Margaret to his office one April morning. "Mrs. Holloway, I wanted to thank you. Whatever happened with Sergeant Brandt and that cornbread situation, however you managed it, it's made a significant difference in camp morale. We've had fewer incidents, better cooperation, even some of the prisoners asking if they can learn more about American customs and language." "It wasn't magic, Captain," Margaret said. "It was just honest conversation and food. Food has a way of bringing people together." "Well, whatever it was, keep doing it. You're doing important work here." As Margaret walked back to the kitchen through the spring sunshine, she thought about her grandmother, about her mother, about all the women who'd sustained life through their cooking. Subscribe to Forgotten Testimonies, where silence is never forgotten.